Good morning, friends, and welcome to our Friday morning live stream here at Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Vaddha, and I'll be leading the live stream here today. And I'm in a slightly different space, so you'll see a little bit different imagery. But I hope you're all having a wonderful morning and that your Dhamma practice has been going well. And I see a few comments to start us off already. So we have very kind, warm greetings from Julie. Hello, Julie, if you're still here. And hello into the future, Julie. And hello also, Joseph. Very kind, warming greetings from Joseph. And hello to Karuna as well, and Manol. Good morning. As well as Andre. Oh, hello, Andrea. He stayed with us for a time in Italy. So hope you're doing well. Hope your practice has been going pleasantly. Hello, Bhumika and Maria. Good morning to all of you. And I think that we can start off the live stream just with a few minutes to kind of settle into the occasion here. So we can just, maybe you've had a busy morning or maybe you've had an uneventful morning, and we can just take this time to collect some of our mindfulness so that our mind is a little bit more present and clear, a little bit more still and aware. So we'll just take about 5 minutes to kind of gently develop some mindfulness. So I'll put up this so that anyone who joins is aware. And we can just settle into a comfortable posture. And so long as you're not too sleepy or drowsy, feel free to close your eyes. And we don't need to do anything this time in particular. You can just start to allow any sounds or thoughts or sensations. Just allow those to arise. And just watch them with a mind of letting go or a mind of detachment. So this will still be very coarse. Of course, we won't be perfect. But we just introduce a little bit this attitude of just allowing our surroundings to open up to us, our internal surroundings with our moods and thoughts, and our external surroundings with any external sensations. And so we start to build up a kind of calm barrier between the mind that wants to grasp and react and the naturally arising things that we experience. So just developing a little bit of equanimity, just mindfulness and equanimity towards our internal and external situation. And then if we like, if you have any silence or if you have a nice calm breath sensation that allows you to focus in, you can just start to enjoy that peaceful, steady rhythm of silence or breathing or any other theme that helps calm the mind and develop awareness. And just try to get a sense of that very fresh, bright feeling of presence. Okay, so now we can start to send our awareness back to what we see and what we hear with more attention and detail. But hopefully that's just those few minutes help to clarify your mind a little bit for the Dhamma talk, kind of prepare the space so that you can receive anything that might be helpful to you. And I'll say hello just to a few more, to Judy and Gregory and Jayanta, good morning, as well as someone with a Burmese script name, which I can't read, unfortunately. Okay, so friends, at this time I'll pay respect to the Buddha, our teacher, and the reason for which we have these Dhamma teachings. And then we can open up. I'll offer some reflections, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat, and we can discuss those later on. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang saranang gacchami. Okay. So one of the things that I've been reflecting on and that I think is useful for all of us Dhamma practitioners is looking a bit deeper at this topic of refuge, right? So after I paid homage to the Buddha with the traditional Namo Tassa, one of the chants that's often done by monastics before giving a Dhamma talk is saying, I go to refuge to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. And so this can be sometimes done as a ceremony, sometimes done as chanting, sometimes done as a internal reflection or a kind of internal, almost like a vow. And it's one of the things that makes someone, we could say, a Buddhist, right? So when we use the word Buddhist, obviously we start to get into complicated labels and demographics, and it starts to become a little bit blurry what we're talking about. But one of the ways that of talking about a Buddhist or a person who is Buddhist, I think in more meaningful terms, in terms of the Dhamma, is where does someone take refuge, right? So someone who is raised in a culture that has Buddhist iconography and Buddhist rituals and Buddhist architecture and Buddhist chanting and so on, they are Buddhist, and that can be extremely meaningful. But if it's not looked at from the lens of the Dhamma, if we're not approaching the teachings on a personal level, on an introspective level, then I would say that the Buddha as a teacher, the historical Buddha as a person who lived and taught and attained awakening, he wasn't so much interested in that, right? He was more interested in the introspective aspect, in the practice, in the uprooting and working with our greed, hatred, and delusion, and freeing ourselves from the suffering of desire, from the suffering of aversion and hatred and war and conflict, from the suffering of confusion and identity and comparison, and above all, from the suffering of repeated rebirth and continued existence in various realms where we continue to take life, get old, sick, and die. And so that's really when we're talking about what makes someone a Buddhist, what makes us a Buddhist. This is really what we should be most closely examining, I think. Now, it's important, obviously, to mention a caveat here that really when we do these reflections, we should mostly be directing them to ourselves, right? So we don't look at what other people are doing and then put them down or put ourselves above them. Instead, we should humble ourselves and look at what am I doing, right? So maybe someone else says they're a Buddhist, and we shouldn't criticize them internally or externally unless it's an appropriate time with loving kindness and it's beneficial and so on. Because it's really mostly only beneficial to look, how can I be a better person, right? And so the label Buddhist here, it's not so important, but we can just use it as a kind of measure for investigating our practice. And that's what's most important from the perspective of a Dhamma practitioner, right? So not from the perspective of society or from the meaningfulness of culture. We're not looking at it from that perspective, but when we investigate ourselves from this perspective, it's really, how can I be a better practitioner? Or what exactly do I practice? Is it Buddhism or is it something else, right? And so going for refuge is the kind of basic definition, the kind of basic staple for how the Buddha and his disciples, both lay and monastic, talked about becoming a Buddhist, at least indirectly. So in the discourses, in the early suttas, when someone is in a conversation or dialogue with the Buddha, sometimes maybe one of his disciples as well, if they're very impressed and they feel very confident in the Buddha's teachings, then at the end, after they've listened to the Buddha speak and they've kind of exclaimed their faith and their confidence and how clarifying it was to hear the Dhamma, then they'll say that they go to refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the mendicant Sangha, so the Bhikkhu Sangha. And so this is something that's been done according to the suttas, according to the discourses, since the time of the Buddha and even to the face of the Buddha himself. And in the Vinaya Pitaka, this is how if someone wants to become a novice, for example, they have to take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And so it's something that we find in the text, and it's something that we find in modern days. But it's applied in different ways, right? So, of course, we can recite it, and we can say it, and we can think it, but is it true, right? Is it true? So I think even just this question of what is refuge, or what does it mean for me to go to refuge or go for refuge to the Buddha, to go for refuge to the Dhamma, and to go for refuge to the Sangha? What does that mean? And there's different levels to this. So one level of this is, of course, on the level of definition. So on the level of definition, there's 3 refuges. And these are as I've listed. We have refuge in the Buddha. And this is the Buddha, specifically the person, the Buddha, Gautama Buddha, who attained awakening under the Bodhi tree in ancient India and then disseminated his teachings. And traditionally, there are a list of qualities of the Buddha that are recollected that kind of go hand in hand with refuge in the Buddha. So these are, for example, that the Buddha is a worthy one, that he's worthy of offerings, and that he is perfected, and that he's completely awakened, that he has perfect, or that he's accomplished in both knowledge and also in his conduct and behavior. So both, we could say, theory and practice are perfect. He's accomplished in them. That he knows the world, he understands the world, and he understands the things in the world, or how the world arises and ceases, and so on. So we don't have to go through all the qualities in this moment, but those are a list of qualities that someone who gains faith in the enlightenment of the Buddha, who gains faith in the Buddha as an enlightened teacher who was able to teach, who was worthy of teaching, who was what he said he was, and who taught what he himself had accomplished. This is one way of talking about refuge in the Buddha. And then there's refuge in the Dhamma, the second refuge. So this is going for refuge to the Dhamma. And the traditional list of qualities for the Dhamma are that the Dhamma is well expounded. And so here we might take the Dhamma to mean the teachings of the Buddha about what he attained, about reality, about the nature of our experience. And so we say that the Dhamma was well exclaimed, svakato bhagavata Dhammo, well exclaimed, well expounded, well taught by the Buddha. And we say that it's sanditiko akaliko ehipasiko. So it's visible or apparent in this very life. So we don't need to wait on a promise for the next life, but rather that the Dhamma is something that can be seen in the present. Akaliko is very similar. It means means timeless, or not bound by time, in the sense that, again, we don't have to kind of wait or put our bets towards the future and hope that it's true. It's something that can be verified in the present. It's something that can have results immediately. And ehipasiko means come and see, investigate, and see for yourself. So it's something that can be investigated and seen for oneself. Again, around this similar theme of investigation and of visibility in the present. And there are other qualities of the Dhamma as well, but these are some of the qualities of the Dhamma in terms of the Buddha's teachings that one would recite, that one would recollect, and that one can meditate on to gain faith and inspiration and joy. And then there is the Sangha. And the traditional list of qualities of the Sangha refers to the noble Sangha, or specifically in Pali, what's known as the Savaka Sangha. So this is the Sangha of disciples, but it means specifically the disciples who have attained different stages of enlightenment, different stages of awakening. And so this is a recollection of the qualities of those disciples of the Buddha who have followed the Dhamma and then who have realized that Dhamma for themselves to some degree or another. And this is recollecting, for example, that the practice to become awakened in the members who have become awakened, those people, they've practiced well. They haven't practiced kind of not so well here and there, but in order to achieve what they've achieved, their practice was good. And their practice was very direct and straightforward. It wasn't confused or crooked. It was straightforward and upright. And their practice was methodical. So it wasn't magical or random, but it's methodical. There are causes and conditions that they can follow and that can lead to particular results in a particular training. And so these are, again, a list of certain qualities of the Sangha that can be recollected and that can bring faith and that can bring joy. And so this is one way of talking about refuge. So when we speak about going for refuge, we can recollect these qualities. So do I find faith and joy and inspiration in these particular qualities and in these particular aspects of the Buddha's teaching? So in the Buddha himself, in his teaching, the Dhamma, and in the disciples of the Buddha who realize that Dhamma, the Sangha. And if we find these qualities inspiring, I recommend that you work on that you establish that further and deeper, that you develop it and cultivate it and make it a basis, make it a vehicle for your practice, right? Because these recollecting, wow, the Buddha, he had these qualities. The Buddha knew what he was talking about and he walked the talk, right? He did what he said. He had realized what he said and he knew what he was saying. These types of qualities, the Buddha understood the world, or that the Dhamma that the Buddha taught, if we can investigate it, it can be realized individually. It's visible in this very life. So these can bring faith and joy and confidence and inspiration. And these can lead our practice onwards, right? These can develop our practice. Because if we believe that the Buddha really was enlightened, and we believe that what he said really made sense and really is possible to see, and that there really are people who have seen it, who have realized it themselves by practicing well, then anything that we do that falls short of our practice, that falls short of practicing the Dhamma, is really only an excuse, right? And so this is one aspect of refuge here. It's finding joy, finding inspiration to practice, to go deeper, to inspire ourselves, and to have higher role models in life so that we're not the only ones who, we feel superior or maybe we feel inferior, or we feel the same as everyone else, but rather we know there actually are these lofty ideals. And these lofty ideals can be accomplished, but it's not because of who we are or who others are, but rather what conditions and what practices have we put into place so that the results can come about, right? So it both inspires us and uplifts us, but it also can humble us. So we don't think that, we're this amazing person or we're this horrible person, or everyone is just the same, but rather there's this balance. Humility, because the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha are so much greater than we could ever be, but also confidence and self-esteem, because the Buddha, the Dhamma, and Sangha are actually ideals that can be accomplished. No matter who we are. And then another way of talking about refuge is really investigating the word refuge, right? So rather than the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, we can look at this word refuge, which in Pali is sadhana, sadhanam. Sadhana, refuge, this is where we go. So I go for refuge to the Buddha, or I go to the Buddha as refuge. So it's, in a sense, describing the Buddha, describing the Dhamma, I go for refuge to the Dhamma, and describing the Sangha, I go for refuge to the Sangha. And it's also this kind of activity of going, right? So we're going for refuge. This is what we're doing, and we're taking it, we're going for it in the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. So what is this refuge that we're going for? What is this quality that the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha hold? Right, and these are investigations and meditations that we can ourselves investigate, because each one of us has to realize what this means deep in the heart, right? So we start with definitions, we start with discussions, and then we go deeper and we start to contemplate. And then we start to arrive at a deeper sense of what this means in order to inspire our practice and clarify our practice. And so a few reflections on refuge would be, for example, where do we find safety? Where do we find peace? Where do we find what we're really looking for, right? Happiness and security. So do we go to refuge, or do we go for refuge to the refrigerator, right? That's a common example. Do we go for refuge to the pantry to get food and take refuge in food? Or do we go for refuge to entertainment, to consuming information or in learning? Do we go for refuge in learning? Or do we go for refuge in conversation and talking with other people about this and that? So that means that we find safety in those things, right? When we're scared, or when we're sad, or when we're anxious, or when we're depressed, do we take refuge in those things, right? Distractions, entertainment, food, learning. Things outside of the senses that pull us outward and take us away from the inward emotions and sensations that we experience. Or, for example, even if we're not trying to take away and hide any inward emotions, but maybe we just want to experience greater pleasures, and so we find that greater pleasure in outside things. So how can we really say that we go to the Dhamma for refuge if we don't? How can we say that we go to the Dhamma for refuge if instead we go to the senses for refuge, and we go to distractions and entertainment and chatter and all these other things for refuge? Right? So that's something that we can reflect on, is, do we go to the Dhamma for refuge? Maybe we believe in the Dhamma, maybe we have faith in the Dhamma, but is that really enough? Is that really what it means to find safety in something? So we can give an analogy, if, say, there's a war going on, and there are bombs or gunfire and other dangerous things. And so we have an option, right? We can find safety under maybe an abandoned building. We can go inside and hide in there and find safety from the conflict. Or maybe we join the conflict and we're out in the open. And that would be dangerous. That would not be safe. That would not be refuge. That would not be going for refuge. That would be amidst conflict, amidst danger, strife, and peril. And so that's what the world of the senses, that's what the world of desire is, right? The world of desire is the world of old age, sickness, and death, of sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair. That's what the world of refuge is for most people. That's where refuge is found, right? It's found in unstable things. And so refuge in the Dhamma is really trying to turn our mind away from that. And I think that this is something, by reflecting on it, it's not something that we should shame ourselves with. It's not something that we should kind of hit ourselves and feel sorrow and so horrible that we don't live up to this high standard. Because in reality, it's very difficult, right? It's very difficult. But it's the very act of reflecting, it's the very expectation itself. And that is what will push us to live to this higher standard that all of us can live to, right? It's this very act of saying, I need to admit where I don't live up to what I profess. And by admitting that, by facing it, by turning towards it, that's where the heart can see. That's where the heart can know what's really happening. What am I really doing? What are the choices that I'm really making? And what are the choices that I want to make? Or what are the choices that I can make, that I could be making, that are much higher and better and safer for myself, others, and everyone around? Right? So we look at our choices. We look at where we take refuge. Especially refuge in the Dhamma. Because I think that when we boil it down, refuge in the Buddha, refuge in the Sangha, they can really kind of be boiled down to the Dhamma, right? Because where does the Buddha come from? He arises from the Dhamma. Right? Because when we take refuge in the Buddha, we're not taking refuge in a corpse. Right? We have to take refuge because that's not refuge. If we take refuge in bodies, then we see how painful that is, right? When someone that we love dies, or when we die, or when we face illness and death. And then we see the difficulty now. If we took refuge in the body of the Buddha, then where is he? We can't see him. We don't know where he is. There are supposed relics of the Buddha, but how many of those are authentic, if any? So taking refuge in the body of the Buddha, it's not what it means, right? We can't do that. And we should know on an intuitive level that that's not really safe. It's not safe to take refuge in bodies, because bodies are of the senses, bodies are of the external world, bodies are inconstant and impermanent, they're painful, they're impersonal, they don't belong to the Dhamma in that higher, loftier sense, right? Of course, they do belong to the Dhamma in terms of their principles, the principles that they abide by, but they don't belong to the Dhamma in terms of being a refuge. And so refuge in the Buddha, it's really refuge in these qualities of heart, and this teacher who arose out of the Dhamma. And that quality of refuge in the Buddha is timeless. That's why it's still relevant today, right? Even though the Buddha is no longer here, it's still relevant today. So there was a time when there was a monk who he hadn't seen the Buddha yet, and if I remember correctly, he was sick. So he thought, well, I should go see the Buddha, I should go travel, and I should see him before I pass away, just in case, because I haven't got to see the teacher yet. And so this monk, he decides that he's going to travel, and he goes to see the Buddha, to venerate him, to honor him, to worship him and praise him, so that he has the opportunity before he passes away. And he travels this long way, and he arrives, he gets to the Buddha, and we can imagine that he bows down and pays his respects. And he's offering this honor and this praise and this, you can clearly tell this is someone who has deep faith and confidence and joy in the Buddha and the teacher, which is something that we just talked about, that we praise, that we should be developing. But when he gets there, the Buddha doesn't say, sadhu, sadhu, you've taken refuge in the Buddha, you've taken refuge in the teacher. The Buddha says something along the lines of, what is the point of honoring this and seeing this putrid, rotting body? The Buddha says, one who sees the Dhamma sees the Buddha, and one who sees the Buddha sees the Dhamma. So see, the monk didn't have to travel anywhere. If you want to see the Buddha, you don't need to go to Bodh Gaya or Sri Lanka. If you want to see the Buddha, you look inside your heart and you see, what am I doing that goes against what the Buddha taught? What am I doing that breaks these principles of Dhamma, these principles of reality that are incontrovertible, that are always true, that always apply, but that we break and cause ourselves suffering out of ignorance? That's how we can see the Dhamma. That's how we can pay respect to the Buddha, right? Now, of course, we can have the caveat that it's not that this monk was mistaken or a bad person for going to see the Buddha. It's not anything like that. The Buddha's body. Of course, people had to hear the Buddha to hear his teachings and pass them on and so on. But when we look at these higher principles, this is what the Buddha was pointing to, right? And this means something, though. It means, again, that you have this potential. We have this potential. Everyone has this potential. People you don't like, people you like, people you're neutral to, they have this potential. They can see the Buddha himself. They can come face to face with the Buddha. They can realize the Dhamma in their hearts. And the only reason that we don't is because of our ignorance. The only reason we don't is because we don't understand the pain that we cause ourselves and others by breaking these principles of Dhamma, by trying to swim against the current, despite the futility of that. And so we can have compassion, right? This is an act of compassion. When we reflect on what refuge means, when we reflect on refuge in the Dhamma, we have compassion for ourselves and for others. We have compassion. Okay, I'm suffering. Okay, they're suffering. Okay, sometimes I make bad choices. Sometimes they make bad choices. But those bad choices are because of ignorance. It's not because of something deliberate in that sense. Now, of course, choices can be deliberate, but it's not that if we really knew, we wouldn't do that. That's what the Buddha teaches in terms of ignorance and our choices and in our actions and intentions, that really they're born of ignorance. We don't want to suffer. So we do these things because we want to be free from suffering. It's just that we don't quite understand how to be free from suffering. And so we make mistakes, and that's why we need to be guided. And that's why we need to do these reflections and hear these teachings and bring them inwards so that we contemplate, where am I ignorant and where is my goal actually set, right? If we can set our goal, then we can start to aim and align ourselves with it. This is one of the highest blessings in the Mangala Sutta. Atta Samma, in the Mangala Sutta we say, Parirupadesa vasocha pubbecha katapunyata atta samma paridhicha etam mangalam uttamam. So that's suitable conditions or suitable living places, as well as having done good deeds and made merit in the past, and rightly directing ourselves on a proper course. This is the highest blessing, right? So this directing ourselves into the right course in line with the goal of the Dhamma. Once we come to face what mistakes we may have been making, what mistakes we are making, what mistakes we could make potentially in the future, by contemplating where we find refuge, then we start to align ourselves and go towards that goal, but with an attitude of compassion towards ourselves and others, right? When we make mistakes, when others make mistakes, we recognize that. We recognize it as a mistake. We recognize it as harmful. And we restrain ourselves in the future, but we don't beat ourselves up, right? We don't get our sense of self involved, because getting our sense of self involved is also going against the Dhamma. It's not taking refuge in the Dhamma, right? According to the Dhamma, it's not that we are bad people or we are great people because of our precepts or our observances or our practices or our meditation or our mind states or our mind qualities, but rather the Dhamma is what's excellent. The Dhamma is what's beautiful in the beginning, middle, and end. Anything that we might have or not have is just a matter of, is the Dhamma present or absent? If it's absent, we should strive so that the Dhamma can arise in our hearts. And if it's present, we should venerate the Dhamma. We should venerate that opportunity to come closer towards what the Buddha was teaching and his enlightened disciples from so long ago. Every time the Dhamma arises more in your heart, you come closer to the Buddha and to his Sangha. And so that's what's beautiful. It's not you, it's not me, it's not anything like that. It's the Dhamma itself. And so when we take refuge in the Dhamma, we get this sense of confidence and faith, like I mentioned, but also humility, and also compassion, and also aligning ourselves. So there's all these benefits which we can list and which we can reflect on when we start to contemplate what refuge in the Dhamma means. And when we bring it into our hearts, so we don't say Dhammang saranang gacchami blindly or kind of empty in a ritual way. But every time we take refuges, even if it isn't a ceremony, even if it is a ritual, we contemplate, what am I saying? If I say Dhammang saranang gacchami, I should be ashamed if I then go enjoy sensuality 5 minutes later. Right? We should be ashamed. Within this context of compassion, within this context of impersonality, but ashamed of that quality, right? Because refuge in the Dhamma isn't refuge in sensuality. Refuge in the Dhamma isn't refuge in boasting and bragging, or refuge in the Dhamma isn't refuge in, anything outside, anything that has to do with entangling ourselves in the world, entangling ourselves in our thoughts. So when we take refuge in the Dhamma, this is how we do it. This is what we reflect. And it's this communion, it's this proximity, it's this close invitation from the Buddha for us to venerate him, for us to see him. Right? So we can bow to Buddha statues, and sometimes it's also a question, right? How accurate is this artist's depiction? The Buddha wasn't depicted for likely several hundred years until after his passing away. And so when we bow to Buddha statues and we develop that sense of respect and faith and confidence that some people can find when they're bowing to Buddha statues, which is very wholesome, that's good, but still it's only a kind of shadow of the Buddha. But if you can find the Dhamma in your heart, if you can take refuge in the Dhamma and you can follow those principles to the best of your ability, without beating yourself up, without lifting yourself above other people, but just sticking to what is Dhamma, what is not Dhamma. I bow to the Dhamma, and I will turn away from what's not Dhamma. Then you're getting really close to the Buddha. Then you can start to see the Buddha face to face, right? And then this can also help us actually in very difficult times, right? Because let's say that we're facing something challenging. Let's say that we're facing something like death or old age or sickness or stress. Or maybe people are doing things in our lives that we're not so happy with. We don't agree with what they're doing, or we wish they did it this way or that way, or they're not treating us how we wish they treated them, how we wish they treated us, I should say. Any kind of difficulty in our life, we can find this safety, right? When we reflect, oh, this isn't very comfortable. This isn't how I want it to be, but this is what the Dhamma is. This is how it is, right? So if someone gets sick, say, I don't like this, it's painful. And we don't need to hide that. We don't need to pretend it isn't there. Of course, we should try to overcome it and transcend it, but we don't need to jump to that without actually doing the work, right? But at the very least, what we can do when we take refuge in the Dhamma is we can say, this is painful, but I bow to the Dhamma. This is the Dhamma. This is what I bow to. This is what I take refuge in. I bow to this. And then we can start to have more acceptance come into our heart because we develop more awareness of reality, right? Instead of focusing internally on our reactions and emotions and likes and dislikes, we bow. We bow to the Dhamma. So when someone mistreats us, we bow to them, right? Internally, maybe. Even externally, if that's appropriate, we bow. Thank you. Because this is the Dhamma. This is what's arising right here in the present moment in reality, according to the principles taught by the Buddha. This moment, this Dhamma, this reality is what I need to understand in order to attain freedom. It's not by hiding from it. It's not by changing it. It's understanding it, right? So when we bow to the Dhamma, when we find refuge in the Dhamma, that means refuge in reality. Whatever is real, whatever is happening, whatever principles it's working by, like impermanence or painfulness, whatever conditions give rise to certain results, we bow, right? Because no matter how painful or how pleasant it might be, that's reality. That's how it is. And that's what we take refuge in. We take refuge in reality, not in our preferences. And so that is also something very beautiful, I think, when we appreciate it. It might sound difficult or it might sound beautiful, however it sounds to you, but you can kind of see, hopefully, that when we start to develop this deep sense of admiration, of respect and joy and confidence, but also humility, right? Of it's not about me, it's about the Dhamma, it's about reality. It's not about how good I am, it's about how good the Dhamma is. It's not about how painful this is, it's about how vivid the Dhamma is. Then it can take off that burden that we inflict on ourselves, right? So, refuge in the Dhamma. I go for refuge to the Dhamma. I find safety in the Dhamma. I find security in the Dhamma. You can reflect in your life, for example, as a mindfulness practice throughout your day, as a kind of meditation. What am I finding safety in? It might be certain trains of thought. By thinking about these things compulsively, there's a kind of safety. Or it might be indulging again in sensual pleasures. By indulging in these, there's a kind of safety. It might be people, it might be learning, it might be anything. Anything that isn't investigating and coming to face what is happening in the heart and understanding how it works, then it's something else. It's not the Dhamma, right? And so taking refuge in the Dhamma doesn't mean we need to be perfect, because that's going to be very difficult. And taking refuge in the Dhamma is a step towards that difficult journey. But it just reminds us that we're not shooting for anything less than perfect, right? And so by taking refuge, by investigating refuge, by looking, where do I take refuge? What do I take refuge in? How do I take refuge? Then we start to expose and open up the practice. It starts to become real, it starts to become vivid and alive, right? Rather than something just said or thought about. So it's become something very strong, very powerful. And this recollection or reflection on the refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha, it could be your whole practice. This could be your practice for a month, a week. It could be your practice for half a year, for a whole year. Just focusing specifically on, what do I take refuge in? Humbling yourself to that, developing joy and faith and confidence and inspiration to strive in accordance with that. And then wherever you take refuge in something else, noticing that and turning away from it. Taking refuge again in Buddha Dhamma Sangha and shooting for that again, right? So every time, this can be our whole practice. For example, we break a precept. Okay, we took refuge in something else. We took refuge in personality and self. We took refuge in something else. Go back to the Dhamma. Take refuge in the Dhamma. Take refuge in the Sangha. Take refuge in the Buddha. Turn again. Recognize it. Face it. Don't disparage yourself. Disparage anything less than the Buddha Dhamma Sangha is not worthy. And then you continue on. And every time you do that, right, it should strengthen in your heart the determination to abide by moral principles. Because they don't just become these dry rules, they become principles of Dhamma. It becomes less of a technicality and more of an issue of the heart, which is what Dhamma is really about, right? It's what the precepts are really about. So if we do something, for example, out of greed, we recognize, okay, there was greed. That's not the Dhamma, that goes against the Dhamma. But I can understand this greed in line with the Dhamma. And so then maybe we investigate it and we open it up and we start to learn why that greed arose and why we acted out of the greed and how that pattern happens. What are the causes and conditions that give rise to that kind of reaction? And so by then turning away towards the Dhamma, even our mistakes can become fruitful for our practice, and they can become something that encourages us to make less mistakes or encourages us to become closer and closer to those principles we take refuge in, right? So this kind of deep reflection is something I really encourage. And I haven't gone in too extreme detail of kind of the specifics of how it can look, because it can look many different ways. But I hope that this is something that inspires you to really find in your heart what is relevant. And different levels of this might be relevant to different people, right? The different level of commitment that you're ready to take on. But I hope that this is really something that benefits you and that brings you joy, right? That brings you faith. Like, yes, refuge in the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha, that's real safety, right? Because this is something to be confident and happy about. You're safe as long as you're abiding in the Buddha Dhamma Sangha, right? Whenever we step out of that, then we're not safe anymore. And the only one who can really be fully abiding in the refuges constantly without mistake is an arahant. It's a Buddha or an arahant, right? But at least we can use these refuges as a guidepost so that when we take refuge, when we go for refuge, we might not be there yet. We might be going for refuge. Maybe we haven't arrived at safety, but at least we're going towards it. And so as long as we keep our eye on the goal, we're going in the right direction. Right? And if we notice ourselves going in the wrong direction, we don't need to beat ourselves up. To reiterate this point, we just recognize, oh, my goal's over there. I'll turn around and I go towards that. But we still recognize the danger, right? Because remember, we're not just going towards some arbitrary destination. We're going towards safety, towards freedom, right? So it can also be helpful if you find yourself taking refuge in things other than Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha throughout your life with your actions by body, speech, and mind. Then it can be helpful also to recollect what is not Buddha, what is not Dhamma, what is not Sangha, right? So taking refuge in things that aren't Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, why is that wrong, right? Is it just because someone said it? Is it just because I believe it? Is it because it seems reasonable? No, you should really investigate in your heart the pain and danger in turning away from Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, right? So you can recollect, how painful is it when instead of realizing the liberating potential of aging, sickness, and death, we get mired in suffering and overwhelmed and lost in it, and we feel like everything has lost its purpose and meaning, right? That's very dramatic differences, right? Someone who's very dedicated to refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, aging, sickness, and death might be a beautiful opportunity for them to advance their practice and to help themselves and others. Someone who isn't might be lost in a horrible kind of depression, right? So for ourselves, not judging others, but for ourselves, we recollect on that danger and that peril, and we should turn towards the Dhamma instead. And then when we face others who are taking refuge in things apart from Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, with them, we should start to apply that compassion, which is part of refuge. The Buddha was very compassionate, right? He taught all of us we are just clearly, we required a lot of teaching, right? You can imagine the Buddha understands how everything works, and people just don't get it, or they just don't practice it. But he still taught for 45 years of his life. He dedicated his life to teaching other people for no reason. He didn't do it for praise, honor, and blame, or of course not blame, we could say, but for praise, honor, and gain, I should say. He did it just out of compassion. And so we should, when you take refuge in the Buddha, we should take refuge in that too. We have compassion. We take refuge in the Dhamma. We don't lift ourselves up with a sense of ego and pride above other people, but instead we apply that medicine. Oh, this is why you're suffering. That's so understandable. Maybe you just need someone to listen to you and to open up to you and help heal that suffering with their presence. And then over time, maybe you can be an example for other people as well through your actions or through your speech to encourage them to start to take refuge in something safer. So taking refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, this is something that we can reflect on in many different ways. It has many different benefits, many different advantages and fruits for our practice and for ourselves and others. So I hope at this time that you find this, again, very beneficial and heartwarming, inspiring for your practice. And I'll open it up to questions. So I will just conclude with 3 sadhus together as a community. If you'd like, you can join in so that we can help change our mindset and close and open up into some discussion. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay, looks like we have a group of people joining in. So hello to anyone else who's joined in who is not said hello yet. And I see that there are some questions or comments here. Okay, so one from Nikola Tesla here says, do you know about the murderer Buddha turned into a monk? Yes, this is probably referring to the story of Angulimala, which means garland of fingers, finger garland. And yes, this was someone who, in the discourses of the Buddha encountered this murderer, and the Buddha told him to stop. And eventually he did stop. He stopped all unwholesome actions, and he took refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha, and he became an arhat. So very inspiring story. And you can find that if you'd like to read the story of Angulimala in the Pali discourses, in the suttas, you could go to the Majjhima Nikaya. I can't remember the exact number. I believe it's in the 90s, but you can look for the Angulimala Sutta. Okay, we have a comment from Joe. Hello, Joe. Can you speak of venerating the Bodhi tree? What qualifies what qualities, are recollected when paying respect to the Bodhi tree? Well, thank you, Joe, for your kind comments. And venerating the Bodhi tree, yeah, this is something that's done especially in the Sri Lankan tradition. I don't believe it's done so much in Thailand, though I do believe that they do venerate and respect the Bodhi tree, of course, in probably all Buddhist countries. But I believe in Sri Lanka, especially, and maybe other countries connected to Sri Lankan Buddhism, there's actually particular rituals and ceremonies done to venerate the Bodhi tree, at least that are more well known. I'm sure that they exist in in Thailand and in Burma as well. But so, what qualities are recollected when paying respect to the Bodhi tree? Well, generally speaking, I believe I'm not the best person to ask because I wasn't raised in a culture where this is done. So, I only have a limited exposure to this. But my understanding is that recollecting the Bodhi tree, it's really recollecting the place where the Buddha attained enlightenment. So it's kind of the seat or the sort of ground from which the Buddha arose in a physical sense. And it's also a symbol for the Buddha himself. Before there were Buddha statues, people often used images like Bodhi trees or Bodhi leaves or seats under the Bodhi tree to represent the Buddha. So the Bodhi tree represents the Buddha, and it represents his awakening and the awakening of a Buddha to the Dhamma, you could say. And so when recollecting and venerating it, it's a way of paying homage to the Buddha and really a way of paying homage to the Dhamma as well, right? Because it's recollecting that quality of awakening that the Buddha attained. And instead of just bowing to a tree, you say, so for example, when we bow to a tree, we might just be doing something, it could just be an exercise, or it could be maybe bowing to nature or something like that. Many different cultures might have a veneration of plants and trees, but the Bodhi tree specifically is about awakening, right? It's about the Buddha as an awakened being. So that's kind of the distinction. That's why that's honored and respected in Buddhist cultures. And good morning to Mano as well. Mano says, how can we better define our goals? How can we then become more disciplined in recognition of these goals? Wonderful question, Mano. I think one way of better defining our goals is just this very practice of kind of lifting the question in the heart and the mind. In some traditions, like in Zen and Chinese Chan, they have this practice called Gong'an, right? Koan. Gong'an. Gong'an is like, well, it can have different meanings. Or, for example, huato. So this is where we have a question and we just investigate that one question with this grand sense of curiosity. Like we want to know the answer. And so, for example, we can say like, not even a question, but we can pose it as a question like, I take refuge in the Dhamma. And you can just reflect on that. Like, what is refuge in the Dhamma? Or what does that mean? Or what do I feel when I say that, right? So that's one way of doing it. You just kind of ponder this question over and over again as a kind of meditation period. It can be also throughout your day. Like while you're going throughout your day, you're just constantly wondering like, what is my goal? What is the Dhamma that I'm going for, right? And it's good to have this filtered by teachings through the suttas and other teachers, because we might be mistaken, right? If we just go off our own intuition. But at least if we have a general sense of kind of what we're going for, at least then by reflecting on this question, we can start to clarify maybe where we kind of live up to that standard that we want to live up to, like our goal, and where we don't. And if it's another goal, I would say another good thing that can be done if you have very specific determinations is to practice some meditation or do some kind of practice that helps clarify your mind so that it's less foggy and fuzzy and tied up with, let's say, dust in the eyes, like desire and aversion and confusion. and really set your heart on a determination and then make it 3 times. So, like, for example, if your goal is, I will not kill intentionally any living being, or maybe something very specific, like whenever I see an insect in my house, I will not intentionally try to kill it. Something like that, right? Is so if you have a determination like that, then calm your mind, clarify your mind so that your perspective isn't too biased to the best of your ability. Of course, it will be, but we can try to eliminate that to some extent. And then make this determination 3 times. And so hopefully that helps settle it into the mind. And then becoming more disciplined, I would say recollecting the goal is really important. That's kind of why I was stressing recollecting, like Buddha, refuge and Buddha Dhamma Sangha, because we have to recollect it again and again, right? Because we have such strong habit tendencies and energies to do things against the Dhamma that we really have to recollect again and again the safety in the Dhamma, our aspiration to find safety in the Dhamma, and the dangers and perils of what is not Dhamma. So yeah, I'd say really the best way that I can think of for how do we become more disciplined is recollecting again and again our goals, but also the purposes and the benefits. Like, that's the thing. We shouldn't think of it as a chore. We have to think, why am I doing this, and find joy in it. And that's also why ideally, if it's, for example, again, refuge and Buddha Dhamma Sangha, the Buddha offered these meditations on the triple gem, on the Buddha Dhamma Sangha. And these meditations on the qualities of the Buddha Dhamma Sangha, they lead, if they're done properly, they should lead you to joy and rapture, or ecstasy and serenity and peace and clarity and calm and stillness. They should be blissful, pleasant abidings. So they shouldn't be like a chore, or, oh, I have to keep up this aspiration, I have to keep up my goals, but rather it should be like, yes, this is amazing. I have this amazing opportunity to practice this and to strive towards this, and to humble myself to this and bow to this, and I can keep this up, and this is so great for me, and it's so happy, right? That's how we should relate to it. So if you can kind of think about, why do I want to do it? What benefits are there? That can start to lift your mind up to the inspiring reasons for doing something. And so that should make you want to do it, right? Ideally, we want to do our goals. We don't do them because we feel forced to. We should only do something that we feel forced to do if it's like really for our welfare and benefit, right? So of course, it's painful for some people to follow the precepts, but we should really do it if we can. We should really force ourselves to do it. But ideally, we should do it because we want to, because it just feels so good for ourselves and for others. And that's kind of a stepping stone on following the precepts. So that's just an example. It might not be the specific goals you had in mind, but I hope that those reflections are useful. Okay, and then we have another question from Andre. I also love, in connection to contemplating refuge and the theme of the Buddha as best friend or a father, like for monastics, and perhaps everyone deepening that refuge. Yeah, that's also an interesting, useful reflection, especially if you find it really inspiring you. Recollecting the Buddha, yes, as a kind of friend or father. And this is actually something that, for those who might not know, that the Buddha himself said. So the Buddha said, spiritual friendship, kalyanamitta or kalyanamittata, is the whole of the path. So spiritual friendship is something that again and again the Buddha emphasized. So he said that the best external condition for our practice is actually having a really good spiritual friend. The best internal condition is a kind of particular reflective attention or reflective way of understanding what's going on. But the best external condition is a good spiritual friend. And the Buddha said to Ananda, spiritual friendship is so, so important. Imagine where you would be if I wasn't here, if the Buddha wasn't here. And the Buddha says that you should take the Buddha as your friend. You should take him as your spiritual friend, right? Because our friends encourage us, and we tend to do what our friends do. If our friends pressure us to do things. So if the Buddha is our best friend, that's going to be a lot of pressure to do good things, right? So yes, the friend, and also as a father, right? The Buddha is our teacher and is our kind of guide, and yeah, these are wonderful ways of developing a kind of inspiration in the Buddha and in his teachings. So wonderful. And okay, I'll do one more question here. Probably. It says, Vanessa, hello Vanessa. Is the ceremony of taking the 3 refuges a common event in Theravada Buddhism? If so, would Empty Cloud ever consider hosting one? Yes, it is a common event, though it's a little bit different from how it's done, for example, in the Chinese tradition, where there is actually this ceremony that's more kind of focused and very clear, in my experience at least, my limited experience. In Theravada temples and monasteries, it's often kind of done just, like, some people take it maybe even every day, and they might just do it on their own also. Like they might just chant the refuges and refuges and also precepts every single day or twice a day, or for example, every Sunday here at the monastery, the refuges are usually given to people who want to take them. So there is a ceremony actually where a monastic will recite the refuges and lay people will recite them. And there's usually often a little bit of explanation at the beginning if there's new people. And so that is a kind of ceremony that's done, but it's a little bit different because you don't really get, for example, here at Empty Cloud, it's not that people sign up and they prepare and then they take them and so on. It's more like, if you want to take these, we offer them to people. But I think that yes, if there was someone or a group of people who wanted to actually really prepare and really take refuge in that kind of focused way, I think yes, we would be open to it. We would just find a time, and we would. So if you were interested, Vanessa, then you could talk to one of the monks in person or send an email, and I think yeah, we could arrange that, because I'm sure other people would also be interested. Also, maybe doing like a little bit of a deep dive in the refuges and precepts before they take them. Okay, so friends, I'm sorry, I see a question here, how to overcome fear. And so this would be a great question for tonight's monk chat on Friday night. This will be tonight at 7:30 p.m. And I'm sorry if I still saw another question appear from Charles, and apologies, Charles, we're out of time and I hear the bell ringing, so I have to go. But if you'd like to ask your question, Charles, as well at monk chat tonight at 7:30 p.m., you can even leave it in the box earlier and then watch the replay if you're not present, and you can listen to it later. You're welcome to do that. So all of you are invited to monk chat, and I hope that you have a wonderful practice, and again, that this refuge reflection is very fruitful to you, and I hope to hear about it maybe on monk chats or here in the monastery. So please have a wonderful day and very joyful, inspiring, uplifting Dhamma practice today and until you realize Nibbana. Rejoicing in the merits of you listening to this Dhamma and reflecting on it. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu to all of you, and goodbye.